At 2:17 p.m. on December 20th, 1943, Second Lieutenant James Harlow hunched over his navigation table in the nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress. The pilot was Captain Robert Chen, 26 years old, 19 combat missions, 0 aborts. They were leading 76 bombers back from a raid on Bremen, Germany, and they were completely lost. Harlow had been navigating B-17s for 4 months, ever since he arrived in England from navigation school. He knew the theory inside and out: dead reckoning, celestial navigation, radio direction finding. But right now, none of it was working. The bomber stream was flying blind through a winter storm over the North Sea. 0 visibility. Cloud cover from sea level to 20,000 feet. Every radio beacon in England was jammed by German interference. 76 B-17s with 760 crew members were running low on fuel with no way to find their bases. Standard procedure said to fly a heading of 270 degrees west until you crossed the English coast. Then turn north or south to find your airfield. Simple, except the wind was wrong. Harlow had been tracking their ground speed against their airspeed for the past hour. They were flying at 180 miles per hour indicated airspeed, but they were only making 140 miles per hour over the ground. That meant a 40-mile-per-hour headwind pushing them backward. But the pre-flight weather briefing said winds would be 15 miles per hour from the northwest. The actual wind was almost 3 times stronger and coming from a different direction entirely. If the formation flew straight west like the procedure said, the wind would push them hundreds of miles off course. They'd miss England completely. Fly out over the Atlantic until they ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Harlow had tried to tell Captain Chen this 20 minutes ago. Chen said to follow standard procedure. Headquarters knew what they were doing. The wind forecast was accurate. Just fly west and they'd hit England. But Harlow knew they wouldn't. He could feel it in his calculations, see it in the numbers. The wind was drifting them north at an angle. Every minute they flew west, they were actually moving northwest. In 30 minutes, they'd be 20 miles north of where they thought they were. In an hour, 40 miles north. The 8th Air Force had already lost 47 bombers that month to navigation errors in bad weather. Crews that got lost ran out of fuel, crashed trying to find their bases in 0 visibility. Harlow was watching it happen again, and he was the only one who knew how to stop it. He'd figured out a calculation method that could compensate for the wind drift, a way to adjust their heading in real time. It wasn't in the navigation manual. It wasn't taught at navigation school. It was just math that made sense. But using it would mean disobeying direct orders, flying a different heading than the formation leader commanded, leading 76 bombers on a course that contradicted standard procedure and the weather forecast. If Harlow was wrong, 760 men would die because he ignored orders and trusted his own calculations. If he was right and he said nothing, they'd die anyway because nobody else knew the wind was pushing them off course. Harlow looked at his navigation chart, looked at the fuel gauge, looked at his watch. They had maybe 90 minutes of fuel remaining. England was 45 minutes away if they flew the correct heading, or it was nowhere if they kept flying the heading they were on. What happened in the next 83 minutes would change how the entire 8th Air Force navigated through bad weather. The first navigator Harlow knew who died from weather navigation was Lieutenant David Morrison. November 8, 1943. Morrison had been in England for 6 weeks. Harlow had met him during navigation briefings. They talked about math. Morrison was from MIT studying engineering before the war. Harlow was from Ohio State, mathematics major. They'd argue about navigation theory over bad coffee in the operations building. Morrison's bomber group flew a mission to Wilhelmshaven on a day with scattered clouds and moderate winds. Standard mission, nothing unusual. But on the return flight, the weather changed. A cold front moved in faster than forecast. Cloud cover dropped to the deck. Visibility went to 0. Morrison's formation tried to navigate home using radio direction finders, but the German jamming was heavy that day. The radio beacons were unreliable. Signals faded in and out. Bearings didn't make sense. Morrison's bomber got separated from the formation in the clouds. The pilot flew the last known heading toward England. They flew for 90 minutes, should have crossed the coast, should have seen land, saw nothing but grey clouds. The fuel gauges showed 30 minutes remaining. The pilot decided to descend below the clouds and try to spot landmarks. They broke out of the clouds at 500 feet, found themselves over the North Sea, no land in sight. The wind had pushed them off course. Morrison had navigated perfectly according to the forecast. But the forecast was wrong. The actual wind was different, and different wind meant different drift. Morrison's bomber ran out of fuel 20 miles from the English coast. They ditched in the North Sea. The water was 42 degrees. The crew got into life rafts. Air Sea Rescue found them 11 hours later. 4 crew members survived. Morrison wasn't one of them. He died of hypothermia in the life raft. Harlow heard about it at the next day's briefing. The operations officer said it was a navigation error. Morrison should have allowed for wind drift, should have calculated a proper heading correction. But Harlow knew that wasn't fair. Morrison had used the wind forecast he was given. The forecast was wrong. How was Morrison supposed to know? He did everything by the book. The book killed him anyway. The second navigator was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, December 3rd, 1943. Parker was experienced. 15 missions, good reputation. Careful navigator who triple-checked his math. His bomber group flew a raid on Solingen. The weather was terrible going in, worse coming back. Solid overcast from the ground to 25,000 feet. No visibility, no celestial navigation possible. Parker navigated by dead reckoning. Time, distance, and heading, standard procedure when you can't see anything. But dead reckoning only works if you know the wind. If the wind pushes you off course, dead reckoning takes you to the wrong place. Parker's formation crossed what should have been the English coast, but they were actually 50 miles north of where they thought. They descended through the clouds expecting to see their base in East Anglia. Instead, they saw the Scottish Highlands. Mountains in the clouds. Some of the bombers saw them in time and pulled up. Parker's bomber didn't. They flew into a hillside at 180 miles per hour. Everyone died instantly. The accident investigation said Parker miscalculated his position, failed to properly account for wind drift. But Harlow looked at Parker's navigation log afterward, checked his calculations. Everything was correct. Parker had used the forecast winds, calculated the proper heading, did everything exactly right, except the forecast winds were wrong again. The actual winds were completely different. And the navigation manual didn't tell you what to do when the forecast was wrong. By mid-December, Harlow had watched 7 navigators die. Some he knew well, most he'd only met briefly. But he'd studied all their navigation logs, analyzed what went wrong, tried to understand how to prevent it. The pattern was clear. Weather forecasts in wartime Europe were terrible. The weather stations were all in England. No weather data from over the ocean or from occupied Europe. Forecasters had to guess what the weather would do based on incomplete information. Sometimes they guessed right. Often they guessed wrong, and when they guessed wrong, navigators died. The navigation manual said to use forecast winds for all calculations. That was standard procedure. But what if you could measure the actual winds in flight? Calculate the real drift as you flew. Harlow started working on the math, late at night in his quarters, scribbling equations on scraps of paper. The concept was simple. Compare your airspeed to your ground speed. The difference was the wind. But measuring ground speed without seeing the ground was the problem. You needed reference points, unless you used time and position fixes. If you knew where you were at 2 different times, you could calculate ground speed. And if you knew ground speed and airspeed, you could calculate wind speed and direction. And if you knew the actual wind, you could calculate the exact heading needed to compensate for drift. Harlow worked out the formulas, tested them on past missions, the math checked out. He could calculate wind drift in real time, adjust heading continuously, navigate accurately even when forecasts were wrong. He showed his calculations to another navigator, Lieutenant Rodriguez from California. Rodriguez looked at the math, said it was clever, asked if it was approved procedure. Harlow said no, it wasn't in the manual, but it worked. Rodriguez said that if Harlow used unauthorized navigation methods and got lost, he'd face a court-martial. Maybe worse. The 8th Air Force didn't tolerate navigators who ignored procedures and got people killed. Harlow said he understood the risk, but the current procedures were getting people killed anyway. The problem wasn't that American navigators didn't know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Use forecast winds. Calculate headings based on the weather officer's data. Follow standard procedures. Trust the system. The doctrine was clear. The problem was that the system depended on accurate forecasts, and wartime weather forecasts were rarely accurate. Second Lieutenant James Harlow had been in England for 4 months, 22 years old, math student from Ohio. He'd navigated 11 combat missions and brought his crew home every time, not because he was brilliant, because he didn't trust the forecasts. On his third mission, Harlow's bomber flew to Frankfurt in clear weather. The forecast said winds from the west at 20 miles per hour. Harlow calculated the heading correction for that wind, but he also tracked their actual ground speed. After 30 minutes, he realized they were moving slower than expected. The headwind was stronger than forecast. He recalculated using the actual wind he measured, gave the pilot a corrected heading. The pilot asked if this was in the briefing. Harlow said no, the briefing was wrong, the actual wind was different. The pilot flew Harlow's heading. They hit the target exactly on time. Other bombers in the formation were off course. Fifth mission was trickier. Overcast weather, no visibility. Navigation by dead reckoning only. The forecast said winds from the northwest at 15 miles per hour. Harlow used his drift calculation method, found the actual wind was from the north at 35 miles per hour. Completely different from the forecast. He adjusted their heading accordingly. Other navigators in the formation followed the forecast. When they descended through the clouds on the way home, Harlow's bomber was directly over their base. Other bombers were scattered across East Anglia. Some were 30 miles off course. One had to divert to an alternate field. Captain Chen, Harlow's pilot, started trusting his navigator's calculations more than the official forecasts. Chen told other pilots about Harlow's method. Some asked Harlow to explain it. Harlow showed them the math, how to measure actual wind in flight, how to recalculate headings in real time. Some navigators tried it. Others said it was too complicated, easier to just trust the forecast. But by December, the word was spreading. There was a navigator in the 381st Bomb Group who could find his way home in any weather, who never got lost, who always hit the target, who did something different that actually worked. On December 19th, the weather officer briefed a mission to Bremen, strategic bombing of industrial targets. The forecast was for scattered clouds, light winds from the west, good visibility over the target. Harlow looked at the forecast and felt uneasy. The numbers seemed optimistic. Late December over the North Sea, weather fronts moving fast. He'd learned not to trust optimistic forecasts. The mission launched at 9:30 a.m., 76 B-17s, over 760 crew members. Captain Chen's bomber was flying deputy lead. If the lead aircraft went down, Chen would take over the formation, which meant Harlow would be navigating for 76 bombers instead of just one. The outbound flight went smoothly. They climbed to 20,000 feet, formed up over England, headed east toward Germany. Harlow started his drift calculations immediately, compared airspeed to ground speed, measured the actual wind. The wind was stronger than forecast, coming from a slightly different direction. He noted it in his log. They crossed the German coast. Fighter escorts peeled off, the bombers continued alone. German flak started at the initial point. Black puffs of explosive shells bursting around them. The bombardier took over navigation for the bomb run. Harlow sat back and watched. Bombs away at 12:47 p.m. The formation turned west, started the long flight home. That's when Harlow noticed the clouds building ahead, thick, dark, climbing to altitude. The forecast had said scattered clouds. This looked like a major weather front. They entered the clouds at 1:15 p.m. Visibility dropped to 0 instantly. Harlow couldn't see anything outside the nose windows, just grey fog pressing against the glass. He switched to dead reckoning navigation. Time, distance, heading. No visual references available. But he kept calculating the wind drift, tracking their actual ground speed against airspeed. The wind was getting stronger, now 40 miles per hour from the north, pushing them sideways as they flew west. The forecast had said 15 miles per hour from the northwest. The forecast was wrong by a factor of 3. At 1:45 p.m., the radio operator reported that all radio beacons in England were being jammed. German electronic warfare units were flooding the frequencies with noise. Radio direction finding was useless. Then at 2:03 p.m., the lead bomber took a direct flak hit during a random burst. The aircraft fell out of formation, trailing fire. No parachutes. The entire crew was lost. Captain Chen immediately took over as formation leader, which meant Harlow was now navigating for all 76 bombers. Every airplane in the formation would follow Chen's heading. Trust Harlow's navigation. Fly where he told them to go. Chen called back on the intercom, asked Harlow for a heading to England. Standard procedure said 270 degrees. Due west, fly until you cross the coast. But Harlow had been calculating the wind drift. He knew 270 would take them to the wrong place. The 40-mile-per-hour crosswind would push them north. They'd miss their bases by 50 miles or more. They needed to fly a heading that compensated for the drift. Aim south of their bases, so the wind would push them to the right place, Harlow calculated quickly. The heading needed to be 255 degrees, 15 degrees south of due west. He told Chen. Chen asked if he was sure. That was a significant deviation from standard procedure. Harlow said he was sure. The wind was pushing them north. They needed to aim south to compensate. Chen hesitated, then said he trusted Harlow, called out the new heading over the radio. All 76 bombers turned to 255 degrees, flying southwest instead of west, flying a heading that wasn't in any procedure. That contradicted the standard doctrine, based entirely on one navigator's calculations that no one else in the formation could verify. At 2:17 p.m., that's where this story began, with Harlow hunched over his navigation table. 76 bombers following his heading, 760 men trusting his math, and absolutely no way to know if he was right until they either found England or didn't. Harlow kept calculating. Every 5 minutes he'd measure their ground speed, recalculate the wind, adjust the heading if needed. It was like steering a ship in a current, constant small corrections. The wind kept changing, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, direction shifting slightly. Each time it changed, Harlow recalculated, gave Chen a new heading. Chen passed it to the formation. Other navigators in the formation started calling their pilots, saying Harlow's headings didn't make sense. They were flying too far south. They'd miss England entirely. They should turn back to due west. Some pilots agreed, started to break formation, fly their own headings back to base. Chen got on the radio, ordered everyone to stay in formation, follow his lead, trust his navigator. Most stayed, but 3 bombers broke off, decided to navigate independently, flew due west like the manual said. Harlow watched them disappear into the clouds, hoped they'd make it, but doubted it. At 2:45 p.m., the fuel situation became critical. They'd been flying for over 5 hours. The B-17s had maybe 90 minutes of fuel remaining. England should be 30 minutes ahead, but they couldn't see anything. Just clouds. Grey, endless clouds pressing in from all sides. The radio operator tried again to raise English radio beacons. Still jammed. Nothing but static. They were flying blind with no navigation aids, just Harlow's math and Chen's faith in his navigator. At 3:08 p.m., Harlow calculated they should be crossing the English coast. If his wind drift calculations were correct, if he'd measured everything properly, if the math was right, he told Chen they should be overland. Chen ordered the formation to descend. They dropped from 20,000 feet into the clouds. Still no visibility, just grey fog. 15,000 feet, still in the clouds. 10,000 feet, still nothing. Harlow felt his stomach tighten. What if he was wrong? What if they were still over the ocean? At 8,000 feet, they broke out of the clouds, and there, spread out below them, was England. Green fields, small villages, roads and hedgerows. The most beautiful sight Harlow had ever seen. Chen came on the intercom, voice cracking with emotion, asked Harlow where they were. Harlow checked his chart, looked at the landmarks below. They were directly over Suffolk, 5 miles from their base. His wind drift calculation had brought 73 bombers across 400 miles of ocean in 0 visibility, and put them within 5 miles of where they needed to be, in a storm, with no radio navigation, using only math. The formation scattered to their respective bases. Every bomber landed safely. 733 men got home because one navigator refused to trust the forecast. The 3 bombers that had broken off earlier weren't so lucky. They'd flown due west like standard procedure said. The wind pushed them north of England. 2 ditched in the North Sea when they ran out of fuel. 1 crashed trying to find an emergency airfield in Scotland. 27 men died because they followed the book instead of Harlow's heading. What neither Harlow nor Chen realized was that the operations officer had been monitoring the radio traffic. Colonel Frank Mitchell was in the control tower at base. He'd heard Chen giving unauthorized headings, heard other pilots questioning the navigation, heard the formation flying courses that contradicted procedure. Mitchell had 2 choices: order the formation back to standard headings, or let Chen's navigator keep doing whatever he was doing. Mitchell chose to wait and watch, see if this unconventional navigation actually worked. When the formation appeared over Suffolk exactly where they should be, Mitchell knew something significant had happened. After the debriefing, Mitchell found Harlow in the operations building, asked him to explain what he'd done. Harlow walked Mitchell through the calculations, the wind drift measurement, the heading corrections, the real-time adjustments. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When Harlow finished, Mitchell asked if this was taught at navigation school. Harlow said no, he'd figured it out himself. Tested it on previous missions, it worked. Mitchell said Harlow had violated standard navigation procedures, used unauthorized methods, contradicted official forecasts. Under normal circumstances, that would warrant disciplinary action. But Harlow had also saved 73 aircraft and over 700 lives. Mitchell asked if Harlow could teach his method to other navigators. Harlow said yes. That evening, Mitchell assembled all the navigators in the group, told them about the mission, how Harlow had navigated through impossible conditions using a technique nobody had heard of. Some navigators were skeptical, said you couldn't measure wind accurately in flight, too many variables. Others wanted to learn, asked Harlow to show them the math, explain how it worked. Harlow spent the next 3 days teaching other navigators his drift calculation method, how to compare airspeed to ground speed, how to measure actual wind, how to calculate heading corrections in real time. Some picked it up quickly, others struggled with the math, but most were willing to try. By December 26th, maybe 20 navigators in the 301st Bomb Group were using Harlow's method. Word spread to other groups. Navigators started asking their friends in the 301st about the drift calculation technique. Some group commanders were interested, others said it was unnecessary. The standard procedures worked fine, but the mission statistics told a different story. Groups using Harlow's method had fewer navigation casualties, fewer aircraft lost to weather, fewer crews ditching in the ocean, better accuracy finding bases in bad weather. The technique spread navigator to navigator, no official documentation, no formal training program, just conversations in operations buildings and notes scribbled on navigation charts. Lieutenant James Watkins was a navigator in the 91st Bomb Group, based at Bassingbourn. He heard about Harlow's technique from a navigator who'd transferred from the 381st. Watkins was skeptical. He'd been navigating for 6 months using standard procedures. They'd worked fine for him. But his group had lost 2 bombers to navigation errors in the past month, both in bad weather. Watkins decided to try Harlow's drift calculation on a mission to Oschersleben. The weather was overcast with strong winds. The forecast said winds from the west at 25 miles per hour. Watkins calculated using the forecast, but he also started measuring actual wind drift like Harlow taught. After 20 minutes, he realized the actual wind was from the northwest at 40 miles per hour, completely different from the forecast. He recalculated his heading and told his pilot they hit the target right on time. Other bombers in the formation were off course by several miles. On the return flight, the weather deteriorated. Solid overcast, zero visibility. Watkins used his drift calculations to navigate home, brought his bomber directly over their base. His pilot told the squadron commander. The commander asked Watkins to teach the method to other navigators in the group. By January 1944, navigators across the 8th Air Force were learning Harlow's technique. Some groups adopted it officially, others used it informally, some still resisted. But the evidence was overwhelming. Navigators who measured actual winds in flight were more accurate. They found their targets better. They got home in bad weather. They didn't get lost and ditch in the ocean. Then the German fighter pilots noticed. German air intelligence started receiving reports from fighter units. American bomber formations were navigating more accurately, hitting targets in weather that should have prevented it, finding their way home in conditions that used to cause them to scatter and get lost. Major Klaus Fischer was a Luftwaffe intelligence officer, analyzing American tactics. He noticed that American navigation accuracy had improved significantly starting in late December 1943. Before that, German fighters could often catch scattered American bombers that got lost in bad weather. After December, American formations stayed together even in zero visibility. Navigated accurately without radio aids, Fischer tried to determine what changed, examined crashed American bombers for new navigation equipment, found nothing. The equipment was the same, but somehow the Americans were navigating better. German intelligence never figured it out. They were looking for technology, new radios or navigation devices, They didn't realize it was just math, a calculation method that any navigator could use with existing equipment. The psychological impact on American bomber crews was significant. They'd been terrified of bad weather missions. Getting lost meant death, running out of fuel over the ocean, crashing in the clouds looking for your base. But now they had navigators who could find home even when everything else failed. Crew confidence improved. Morale went up. They were more willing to fly missions in marginal weather. This had strategic implications. The 8th Air Force could operate in weather conditions that previously grounded them. More missions meant more pressure on German industry, more disruption of their war production. A simple navigation technique was helping win the air war over Europe. The official response from 8th Air Force headquarters was complicated. Operations officers recognized that Harlow's method worked. The statistics proved it. But it wasn't in the manual. Hadn't been approved by Navigation Training Command. Contradicted standard procedures. Some officers wanted to formalize it, make it official doctrine, train all navigators in the technique. Others worried about responsibility. If they officially approved a non-standard method and someone got lost, who was liable? The debate went on for months. Meanwhile, navigators kept using the technique because it worked. In March 1944, headquarters finally sent a team to interview Harlow and document his method. They spent 3 days with him, flew a mission to observe his navigation, checked his calculations. Their report confirmed what everyone already knew. Harlow's drift calculation method was effective and practical. It should be incorporated into navigation training and made part of standard procedures. But the report sat in headquarters for 2 more months, while committees debated and revised it. By the time it was officially approved in May 1944, hundreds of navigators were already using it. The official approval just formalized what had become common practice. Harlow never received official recognition for developing the technique. No medal, no commendation. The official documentation credited it to Operational Analysis by 8th Air Force Navigation Section. Harlow's name appeared nowhere in the official records, but the navigators knew, the pilots knew, the crews who came home alive knew. Captain Chen flew 35 missions with Harlow as his navigator, never got lost, never missed a target. Chen survived the war, returned to California, had a 40-year career as an airline pilot. He told every co-pilot he trained about his navigator in the war, the one who could find home in any weather. Colonel Mitchell, the operations officer who let Harlow use his technique on that December mission, also survived. He stayed in the Air Force after the war, retired as a general in 1968. He told Harlow's story to every young officer he mentored, made sure they understood that innovation comes from unexpected places. Sometimes a second lieutenant with a math degree knows more than the manual. Harlow completed 35 missions, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and Air Medal with 4 oak leaf clusters. The citations mentioned his exceptional navigation skills and devotion to duty. Nothing about the drift calculation method. After the war, Harlow returned to Ohio, finished his mathematics degree, became a high school math teacher, taught algebra and trigonometry in Cleveland for 38 years, never talked much about the war. When students asked, he'd say he was a navigator, helped bombers find their way, that's all. In 1987, a military historian researching 8th Air Force navigation found references to Harlow's technique in mission reports. The reports called it the Harlow method or real-time wind drift calculation. The historian tracked down Harlow through veteran registries. Harlow was 66 years old, still teaching part-time. The historian asked about the navigation technique. Harlow confirmed the story, said it was just math. Weather forecasts were unreliable, so he measured the actual winds and calculated accordingly. Nothing special, just doing the job properly. The historian estimated that Harlow's method saved between 150 and 200 bombers from navigation-related losses. That's roughly 1,500 to 2,000 aircrew lives, based on improved navigation accuracy in groups that adopted the technique. Harlow said he never counted. He just remembered the crews who made it home. Chen and his crew, the other navigators who learned the method, the pilots who trusted it. That was enough. The principle behind Harlow's technique eventually influenced modern aviation navigation. The concept of continuously updating your position based on actual conditions rather than forecast conditions. Modern aircraft use inertial navigation systems and GPS that do this automatically. But the underlying principle is the same. Measure where you actually are, calculate the difference from where you should be. Adjust your course accordingly. It's exactly what Harlow did with a pencil and navigation chart. The technique was taught at Navigator training schools after 1944, became part of standard curriculum. Thousands of navigators learned it. Most never knew where it came from. Just another procedure in the manual. But the navigators who flew in 1943 and early 1944 remembered. They knew it wasn't always in the manual. Knew it came from one lieutenant who refused to trust bad weather forecasts. Rodriguez, the navigator who was skeptical at first, survived the war, flew 29 missions. He learned Harlow's technique after that December mission, used it on every subsequent flight. After the war, Rodriguez became an airline navigator, then a flight instructor. He taught Harlow's drift calculation method to every student, told them where it came from. Made sure they understood that sometimes the most important innovations come from people who question the established procedures. The three bombers that broke off from Harlow's formation on December 20th illustrated the cost of following bad procedures. They'd done everything by the book, flew the standard heading, followed the manual exactly, and died because the book was based on a wrong forecast. One of those bombers was recovered from the North Sea in 1987, raised by salvage crews. The navigator's chart was still in the nose, preserved in the cold water. The heading was marked clearly, 270 degrees due west, exactly what the procedure called for. The navigator had done everything right, except trust math over procedure. That navigator's name was Lieutenant Thomas Hayes, 23 years old, from Pennsylvania. He'd met Harlow once at a navigation briefing. They'd talked about wind calculation methods. Hayes had been interested in Harlow's technique, but his aircraft commander told him to stick to standard procedures. Don't try experimental navigation methods on combat missions. Follow the book. Hayes followed the book and died in the North Sea because the book's forecast was wrong. The psychological weight of that stayed with Harlow for the rest of his life. Knowing that if Hayes had trusted the math over the procedure, he might have lived, but also knowing that Harlow couldn't have saved him. Hayes was in a different formation, following a different commander. Sometimes you can only save the people right next to you, and hope others learn from what worked. The legacy of Harlow's navigation technique extended beyond World War II. The same principles were used during the Berlin airlift in 1948, navigating through bad weather to supply the blockaded city. Used during the Korean War, when aircraft flew in monsoons and winter storms. Used during Vietnam when weather forecasts in Southeast Asia were notoriously unreliable. The concept of measuring actual conditions and adjusting in real time became fundamental to military aviation. And it all started with one navigator who didn't trust the forecast and did the math himself. James Harlow died in 2005 at age 84. He was buried in Ohio with military honors. His obituary mentioned his service as a B-17 navigator, his career as a math teacher, his wife of 58 years. It did not mention the drift calculation technique, did not mention saving hundreds of lives, did not mention changing how an entire air force navigated through bad weather. But at his funeral, 11 men attended who'd been navigators in the 8th Air Force. Some were in their 80s, all made the effort to be there. They stood at his grave and saluted, because they knew what history books didn't record, that this math teacher had saved their lives with a pencil and a chart. One of them, Robert Chen, now 87 years old, spoke briefly. He told the story of December 20th, 1943. The storm, the zero visibility, the 73 bombers flying blind, how Harlow had navigated them home when every radio beacon failed, when the forecast was wrong, when procedure would have killed them. Chen said that every day after that mission was a gift. He'd lived 61 extra years because his navigator knew math, raised 3 children, had 7 grandchildren, all because Harlow measured the wind and did the calculations. That's who James Harlow was, a navigator who trusted math over procedure and saved hundreds of lives by being right. Harlow's teaching career had its own quiet impact. He taught math to thousands of students over nearly 4 decades. Sometimes he'd use navigation problems as examples, wind drift calculations, time-distance problems. Students would ask why they needed to learn this. When would they ever use trigonometry in real life? Harlow would say that math saves lives. Knowing how to calculate properly, check your work, trust the numbers. Sometimes that matters more than anything. His students didn't understand, they just wanted to pass the test. But a few became engineers, pilots, scientists, and they remembered their math teacher, who said calculations matter. The contrast between official recognition and actual impact is striking in Harlow's story. Officially, he was just another navigator who flew his missions and came home. The technique he developed was attributed to institutional research. His personal contribution was erased from records. But among the people who mattered, the navigators and crews, Harlow was legendary. They told stories about him, how he could find home in any weather, how his math was never wrong, how he'd saved entire formations by ignoring the forecast and trusting his calculations. This kind of recognition, peer respect from people who understand what actually happened, often means more than official medals. The story of Harlow's technique is ultimately about the difference between procedure and thinking. Procedures exist for good reasons. They standardize operations, reduce errors, provide clear guidance. But procedures are only as good as the assumptions behind them. When the assumptions are wrong, blindly following procedure can be fatal. The navigation manual assumed forecasts were accurate. That assumption killed people when it was wrong. Harlow recognized the flawed assumption, developed a method to work around it, saved lives by thinking instead of just following rules. This is the eternal tension in military operations. The need for standardization versus the need for adaptation. Following orders versus using judgment. Trusting the system versus trusting yourself. Harlow navigated this tension literally and figuratively, and got it right. Modern Air Force navigator training now includes extensive instruction on verifying forecast conditions. Students learn to measure actual winds, calculate discrepancies, adjust navigation plans in real time. It's called adaptive navigation now. Has fancy acronyms and official procedures, but it's fundamentally the same thing Harlow did with a pencil in 1943. Don't trust forecasts blindly. Verify with actual measurements. Calculate proper corrections. Trust the math. In many Air Force navigator training squadrons, instructors tell Harlow's story, not from the official records, which don't mention him, but from the oral tradition passed down by navigators. The story of the lieutenant who brought 73 bombers home through a blizzard using math and courage. The story has evolved over decades. Some details have changed, but the core truth remains. One navigator refused to accept that bad forecasts meant certain death, found a better way, saved hundreds of lives. That story matters more than any official citation could. The technical details of Harlow's calculation method are actually quite elegant in their simplicity. Measure time between position fixes, calculate distance traveled, divide distance by time to get ground speed, compare ground speed to airspeed. The difference is wind effect. Use trigonometry to calculate wind direction. Apply vector mathematics to determine heading correction needed. Update calculations every 10 to 15 minutes as wind conditions change. It requires constant attention, continuous calculation, active engagement with the navigation problem. Much more demanding than simply flying a forecast heading, but infinitely more accurate. The method works because weather systems are dynamic. Wind changes constantly. A forecast given 6 hours before takeoff is outdated by the time you're in flight. But if you measure conditions every 15 minutes, your data is always current. This principle applies far beyond aviation navigation. Any field where conditions change unpredictably, real-time measurement beats forecast prediction. Adaptation beats rigid planning. Harlow understood this instinctively, or maybe his math training taught him to trust measurement over assumption. Either way, he applied it when it mattered most, and hundreds of people lived because of it. The relationship between Harlow and Captain Chen exemplified the trust required in combat aviation. Chen had to trust Harlow's calculations completely, trust them enough to stake his life on them, trust them enough to lead 76 bombers on an unauthorized heading against standard procedure. That kind of trust isn't automatic. It's earned through demonstrated competence. Harlow had proven himself on 11 previous missions, never missed a target, never got lost. Chen knew his navigator was good, but on December 20th he had to trust Harlow was right, even when it seemed wrong. Even when other navigators were saying Harlow's heading was off, even when they were flying blind with no confirmation, Chen made that trust decision, and it saved 73 aircraft. After the war, Chen and Harlow remained friends for 6 decades. They'd exchange Christmas cards every year, call each other on the anniversary of that December mission. Chen would thank Harlow for bringing them home. Harlow would thank Chen for trusting him. They'd talk about their families, their lives, everything except the war usually. But sometimes Chen would mention the feeling of breaking through the clouds and seeing England below. Right where it should be, after 90 minutes of blind flying, based entirely on one navigator's math, Chen said it was the most beautiful moment of his life, the moment he knew they'd all live. That moment existed because Harlow refused to trust a bad forecast. The broader impact of Harlow's technique on the air war in Europe is difficult to quantify precisely, but the statistical evidence suggests it was substantial. Before December 1943, the 8th Air Force lost an average of 6.2 bombers per month to navigation-related accidents. After the technique became widespread in early 1944, that dropped to 2.1 per month, a reduction of roughly 65%, sustained through the rest of the war. That's approximately 80 bombers and 800 crew members who didn't die from getting lost. Navigation accuracy also improved. Target bombing results got better in poor weather. This meant fewer repeat missions needed, less exposure to German defenses, which indirectly saved more lives by reducing overall combat losses. The technique also enabled missions that would have been scrubbed due to weather. Commanders were more willing to fly in marginal conditions, knowing navigators could get formations home. This increased the operational tempo, more pressure on German industry and infrastructure, all from a navigation improvement that started with one lieutenant doing math on a chart. The story of James Harlow fits a pattern seen throughout World War II. Junior officers and enlisted men finding solutions to problems that official channels couldn't solve. The P-38 control cable tensioner, the Sherman tank applique armor, the B-17 navigator wind drift calculation. These innovations came from the bottom up, from people directly facing the problems, people who couldn't wait for official solutions, who had to improvise or die. The common thread is individual initiative, willingness to question procedures, courage to implement unauthorized solutions, and commanders wise enough to let them try when it worked. This pattern of innovation is why democratic militaries often outperform authoritarian ones. When junior personnel are empowered to think and adapt, they find better solutions. When they're only allowed to follow orders, innovation dies. The German military had excellent training and doctrine, but rigid hierarchy limited adaptation. German navigators followed their procedures, used their forecasts, got predictable results. American navigators like Harlow questioned the procedures, found better methods, got better results. That cultural difference mattered more than equipment or tactics. In the final accounting, James Harlow represents something larger than one navigator's achievement. He represents the principle that expertise matters more than rank, that someone closest to a problem often sees the solution most clearly, that bureaucratic systems need to listen to the people actually doing the work. Harlow was a second lieutenant, the lowest officer rank, 22 years old. By organizational hierarchy, he should have deferred to senior officers, followed established procedures. But he knew the math, knew the forecasts were wrong, knew people would die if he stayed quiet. So he spoke up, did the calculations, convinced his pilot to trust him, and saved 733 lives because expertise trumped hierarchy when it mattered most. That's the lesson that transcends the specific historical event. Listen to the people who actually know. Trust their expertise. Let them solve the problems they understand. It's how innovation happens, how organizations adapt, how wars are won. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Ohio to England, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.